Hey, what's going on, everyone? We're ready to talk about some trees, right? That sounds pretty good to do during the holiday season. Are you listening about some trees instead of doing some other things? Are you procrastinating some holiday things? Do you have all your gifts purchased? Have you participated in our big mass consumerism push to end the year? You got to up those Q4 numbers for some of those people. Have all the boxes arrived from Scamazon? Are you finishing baking up all those cookies? I hope so. The holidays can be stressful. The holidays can sure as heck be stressful. But hopefully you're doing this out of some curiosity, passion, general interest, whatever it might be. I'm Joey. I run a little page called Misanthrope in the Wild. That's just kind of where I just, do my data dump of tree stuff, which is kind of just what I know about. I don't know a whole lot about anything else. Movies, get out of here. Music, get out of here. I mostly just focus on tree stuff, ecology, man, whatever you name it, things like that. Last week, I put out a request for some questions to kind of generate this Q&A session from a lot of folks. I was anticipating, honestly, maybe somewhere around 8 to 10 questions through, and I was going to put together a short little video, nothing too long. You don't want to make it too long so you lose people. The response was way more than I expected, though. Probably somewhere in the neighborhood of like 30 to 35 questions came in. Some of them followed some pretty common themes that I run across: pruning, planting, stem girdling roots. A lot of people came up with stem girdling root questions and planting trees too deep. Took me by surprise. That's not something that a lot of people know much about. So it was good to see, actually. Um, but yeah, so what's going to happen is I'm going to kind of go through some of the questions that I felt like stood out. The pruning stuff is going to be a completely different video. It's very, very involved. I can't sit in my home office in December and teach people how to prune. That's going to be more of a field thing that we do. So there'll be a lot of future videos aimed at pruning. We'll look at planting and installation and stem girdling roots. I'm actually going to be planting a tree at my son's school this spring to kind of um, educate the kids on what it takes to keep a tree alive, water it, nurture it, things like that too. Um, that's all down the road though. So if your question doesn't pop up here, fear not. That might be another day, for a different time. But I do anticipate multiple videos simply coming out of this Q&A session, namely for the questions you all submitted. So thank you for doing that. We're going to jump kind of into it. I'm not going to waste your time anymore. I've done enough of that. We are at 3 minutes of blabbering here. So one of the first questions that came in, Alicia, what is the hardiest flowering tree in Minnesota besides lilacs? This is a tricky question to answer because we look at um, when people think hardy, they think cold hardiness, right? We're zone anywhere 4B, possibly some 5 sprinkling into the state. We'll be 6 in the state here, probably not in the too far off future. But cold hardiness plays a huge role in like what kind of trees we can plant. Flowering trees throws things for a bit of a loop. I try to stick within native plants as much as possible. We're going to have a whole probably lecture series on what it means to be a native plant, making the distinction between aggressive plants and invasive plants, because those words are very rarely used correctly if you're looking at it from like a botanical sense. Um, Flowering trees in Minnesota, if they're native, really kind of like narrows our funnel, right? A lot of people might jump towards crab apples in the Malus genus, Japanese tree lilacs, things like that, syringa species or genus. But if we want to keep true to native in a continental climate, which is where we live, a lot of those profusely flowering tree species would come from a Mediterranean climate a little bit further south. But in a continental climate, we're a little bit limited because our growing season is quite limited and we don't warm up until, sometimes May, it seems like. So, in terms of hardiness and flowering trees, um, I would look at something like along the lines of serviceberry, which is native to the Midwest. So it does encapsulate Minnesota in there. Serviceberry might be sometimes called Juneberry, things like that too. This genus would be the Amelanchier genus. So if you're, tree shopping and you see the common name, it might be serviceberry. Common names are okay, but they don't tell you a whole lot about what you're dealing with. Once you kind of get botanical Latin wrapped around your head, and you maybe memorize and understand a few of your favorite genuses, it can really help you kind of look at companion planting in the future and things like that. So I would look at serviceberry or something in the Amelanchier genus. Showy mountain ash, American mountain ash, both do really well in Minnesota, particularly the further north you go as well. That's in the Sorbus genus, native to Minnesota. Um, we have redbud available in Minnesota now, and I say now because it's um, not been something that's been established in Minnesota for a long time. This is something that horticulturists kind of picked out some traits and elevated some cold hardiness within it. But redbud, Cercis canadensis, has a Minnesota strain, so a very cold hardy strain of redbud. Redbud's kind of cool. It flowers profusely bright pink. It's beautiful. Um, and it's kind of does the opposite that we would anticipate trees to do when they flower. This tree flowers first and then pushes out leaves. Um, so we think about flowering trees in Minnesota, we almost default to crab apples almost exclusively because they're planted all over the place, right? Sometimes it's a little bit obnoxious because you kind of get this monoculture of either a white crab apple, flowering crab apple, or a pink flowering crab apple, and it kind of just repeats itself, and it sometimes gets as obnoxious as an HOA board member or something like that. So you could look at that. And possibly buckeye. Ohio buckeye hasn't shown a proclivity of jumping out of landscapes or anything like that. So a good little ornamental tree, and we kind of lack ornamental trees that are native to Minnesota. So while buckeye might not be exclusively native to Minnesota, it hasn't shown an invasive proclivity with taking over areas as well. So I hope that kind of answers the flowering tree question. One of my favorite trees is showy mountain ash. I had one in my backyard that blew down in the August storm, unfortunately, so he's gone. I'll have to look at a replacement tree, but I would bounce back and forth between serviceberry, probably mountain ash, and that component. A question from Nick. When my family walks through a public park, I'll often take note of tags, chalk, or other types of markers on trees. As a tree idiot, haha, what is the purpose of marking these trees? Is it a municipality keeping track, inventory, or is there some secret society indicating where the dead bodies are buried? Well, Nick, you're not an idiot. You're not even a tree idiot. You're asking questions because you're willing to learn, and that's what we're all doing here. We're learning. You guys are learning about trees. I'm learning how to record myself on some archaic technology that I don't really know how to use, so I hope it even works out for me as well. But Nick, what you're seeing is probably a combination of a few different things. Number one could be a tree inventory. A lot of municipalities do offer tree inventories, and sometimes they'll tag those trees with like a small little metal disc as well. The other component and what the most likely thing might be is emerald ash borer treatment. Most trees that are tagged um, to demonstrate or prove that they've been treated to help prevent emerald ash borer damage results in a disc on the tree, and that disc on the tree oftentimes tells what year the tree was treated in. So emerald ash borer is treated on an every other year cycle. So it's probably just evidence or proof that the tree has either been treated for emerald ash borer or is part of just a larger inventory that a municipality is helping to control and watch over. I've never heard of anybody indicating that there are dead bodies under those trees. But hey, who knows? We're on this, our little existence on Earth is a very small little bit, so there's probably a lot of stuff under those trees that we don't even know about. Let's see, Mona. Mona said that I had an issue with our very old oak tree last year. It was anthracnose. I would be interested in learning more about various tree diseases and what to do about them. Oh man, tree diseases is an entire discipline, right? Pathology, tree pathology. You could, hone your whole expertise just in on that if you wanted to for a career. Um, let's see here. You referenced anthracnose and oaks. I'll say this in general: oaks are having a really hard time right now. Not even related to anthracnose. There's a litany of things going on with oak trees, not just in Minnesota but in America, right? So we have a few years ago, I believe, sudden oak death established itself in California and Oregon. Sudden oak death is it's essentially a brown algae that's parasitic. Came over from overseas and takes over. It's called Phytophthora remora, is a genus and species of that particular algae. Takes trees out almost instantaneously, it feels like. We don't have sudden oak death here, but we do have our own issues that are unique to Minnesota and our oak trees. So anthracnose, what you're describing, anthracnose is a fungal condition of the leaf tissue. The good news is that it's not lethal. We can also kind of predict these types of conditions as well. It was a bad year for leaf fungus in general. Between anthracnose, between oaks, ash trees get anthracnose a lot. It can be June and the leaves are raining off the trees, kind of filling up the gutter and the curb and things like that too. I noticed a lot of that at the state fairgrounds when I drove through in June. Let's see here, maples get anthracnose as well. We had a bad year for apple scab and crabapple trees. And all this was kind of just weather driven, right? We have a lot of things that we can predict with our weather cycles. So for this year in particular, we saw a lot of things pop up from a very wet spring and a very warm winter, right? It was last February, and I believe I was watering my trees because it was in like the low 60s. So it's just not normal. If normal is even a thing we can count on in Minnesota anymore for our trees and kind of anticipating what needs our trees would have. We're watering our trees more, supplemental irrigation. But to your point, Mona, so anthracnose, yeah, anthracnose is a leaf fungus that inoculates the leaf tissue early in the spring, causes some premature leaf drop. Those leaves come down. Sometimes they're slightly distorted. Sometimes they have a lot of lesions or patches on them and things like that. Again, we saw that a lot with crabapple trees. Crabapples probably got hit hardest by the fungal conditions that kind of were just the perfect little opportunity for fungus to work itself through tree tissue. Rusts, apple scabs, tar spot, xyleria fungus, phyllostichtas, all different kinds of things really popped up. Yours has probably had anthracnose and oak leaf blister. Oak leaf blister was really big this year too, kind of growing almost like these kind of nodules or pustules that you would see, then kind of drying out later in the year. What we would do about anthracnose is oftentimes nothing. Anthracnose isn't something we get too concerned about because it has a very, very low mortality rate, if any mortality rate, for an otherwise generally healthy tree. Oftentimes we get late spring, early summer leaf drop on those trees. And then they push out new growth later in the year that becomes unaffected because we're out of that infection window of anthracnose. Other things that would be hitting our oak trees right now, far and away, is two-line chestnut borer. Two-line chestnut borer is an insect native to Minnesota, somewhat related to emerald ash borer, meaning that they're both agrylus species of boring insects. Two-line chestnut borer being native, emerald ash borer being non-native. So we talk about like a native insect harming our trees, and people would say, well, we have a native tree, white oak, bur oak, you name it, being hit by a native insect. So why are we seeing so much mortality with our oak trees? And the answer is largely drought, right? So drought takes our trees and kind of puts them in a fight or flight response. Not even so much fight or flight, but just they're very vulnerable when they become drought stricken or they battle moisture deficit. They can't work their physiological functions like they would otherwise. Their roots underground can dry up a little bit, which means that we have less water grabbing potential or capacity to feed the canopy up top. So when we get really dry, when we get really hot, trees kind of shut down into like a safe mode, right? Your computer acts up and you have to boot up in safe mode, kind of like that. So the trees holding onto moisture as much as it can without that moisture leaving through the leaf tissue. Um, so two-line chestnut borer pops up. That adult insect lays eggs in the upper part of the canopy. Those eggs hatch, they tunnel into the bark, and they start to leach nutrients and water out of the vascular system of the tree. That's far and away probably one of the bigger concerns for oak trees right now, and that's pretty consistent with what the DNR, the Forestry Service, what we've seen professionally. It's probably 2020, 2021. We had a 3-year run of some really bad summer droughts. Even this year, we had globally, it was the warmest year on record to the surprise of no one. That's going to probably continue. But this year was odd. We had the warmest September and driest September on record. Warmest fall on record as well. So as these things change, we have to approach tree care almost as like a wait and see to see what the weather's going to do, or just jump on these preventative treatments rather than being so reactive and waiting till our trees are kind of on the brink of death to try and intervene. We'll talk more about oaks, I'm sure, in the future as well, because it's going to be a tree species that we highlight. And it's going to be a tree species that we can kind of demonstrate what a lot of these diseases look like in the growing season. We'll maybe find some active oak wilt sites, things like that too. Beth responded with her question, and I'm not going to use last names. I don't want to out anybody if they're not comfortable having their whole ID, thrown out there. So Beth mentioned that the biggies for her in particular, birth to death of trees. And I thought that was a really unique approach to kind of think about this. Where she was coming from, she mentioned selection as choosing the right tree in the right spot. Planting, avoiding girdling, which we'll address in a future video, root girdling. It's almost endemic and probably one of the, if not the biggest contributor of premature tree death in our entire urban forest. And our urban forest would encapsulate where we live, so neighborhoods, commercial areas, HOAs, things like that. Let's see here. Appropriate watering and winter protection for the first year or two. Absolutely appropriate watering for the life of the tree. A lot of folks kind of get this misnomer that appropriate watering only applies to trees until they're established. Trees will die of drought. Trees are dying of drought. I'm witnessing it. And we see drought-related stress pop up, just like the question we answered before about oak trees. Pruning, when and how much, when and how much. Gotcha. Yep, pruning video is going to come out probably closer to the growing season when we can be outside, do a little bit more hands-on pruning without my fingers turning blue. And then death of a tree. How to tell when a tree should be removed before it causes a serious problem, and how to minimize expense. Before I get into any of this stuff, Beth, you would absolutely love this book that I'm kind of working through right now. It's called How Trees Die. How Trees Die is written by Jeff Gilman, a former professor at the U of M, working elsewhere in the US right now, though, I believe. Basically, the book kind of looks at, as the book says, how trees die, but how much of that is caused by human error or bringing over plants from overseas, from across the oceans that become invasive here and choke out our native species. That's a way that trees can die. It also looks at kind of tree epidemics that we've had in the past. Kind of the death of the American chestnut through chestnut blight. Emerald ash borer is a huge one as well. And even before that, Dutch elm disease as well. So we've kind of had our generational tree catastrophes, it seems like, pop up. The common thing between all of that is all of that stuff is from across the ocean, and kind of like as we become more of a global economy and there's this back and forth movement of wood and things like that too, these things can happen. These things can pop up. Like emerald ash borer was found in a shipping pallet in Detroit in like 2002 probably at this point, 22 years ago, of emerald ash borer in America. So, never done deliberately. A lot of invasive plants are brought over here on purpose because it's not known if they're invasive or not, which is why the need of native trees is so important. But yes, check out this book, Beth. I think you would get a kick out of it. Kind of this would be like the end cycle of what you're referencing in your question about from the birth to the death of a tree, but something you would really like. Let's see here. I'm not going to go over a whole lot on planting because, as I mentioned, you referenced root girdling. We're really going to go over planting probably this spring through this whole video series. When we plant a tree at my son's school, we'll try and get some photos and video of that and proper install of a tree as well. Um, let's hear the right tree in the right spot. Boy, this is the probably going to offend some landscape architects with this one because they're kind of the ones that always slam that multi-stem river birch right next to the home foundation without ever thinking much about it. Um, the right tree, the right spot. You kind of just named it. The right tree you would have to kind of factor in what are your goals for the site, what kind of soil do you have, um, how easy is it going to be for you to care for that tree, not just in its infancy but kind of into the future as well. Plant far away from your house, leave the house foundation for shrubs. Don't pack that um, you know, autumn blaze maple right next to the house because it's going to probably tip over because they're really weak wooded trees, kind of like the Dollar General tree, I call it. But there's a lot of things to kind of take into account. What else is around that tree? Are we creating a situation where we have an alternate host disease that can, you know, um, begin its life cycle on one plant and jump to another? We see this a lot with red cedar and crabapple trees, or kind of any apple tree for that matter, anything in the Malus genus. Um, So yeah, it's kind of just it kind of comes down to personal preference, but this is something you can always consult with an arborist on. Say, um, boy, I'm looking to put a white pine in my yard, but I have really clay soil, and they would say, well, maybe that's not the best spot. We know that white pines do pretty well in sandy soil and things like that too. So a lot of things to consider rather than just going to the garden center, finding your favorite tree, plopping it in the ground, and then kind of creating this. Sometimes it's a loop of frustration. And boy, I'm guilty of that too. Sometimes I just see that tree and I say, boy, I wonder how that would do in the yard. Um, and it fails. Trial and error. A lot of what I do in my yard is kind of an experiment. The tree that fell over in that storm that I referenced in August was pretty badly root girdled, and I didn't want to correct it. I planted it in the ground as it was to see how long it would last. Got maybe 7 years out of it, unfortunately, before it became really unstable with the really heavy fruit, continued growth with a restricted root zone. I did keep that root zone. I'll save it for a different day for a different video. I think I left it at the office at work. Let's see here. Down to death. How do we know when a tree should be removed before it causes a serious problem, and how to minimize expense? If you have a hard time sleeping at night because the tree is, waving in the wind too close to the house, that might be something. Um, most certified arborists do offer free consultations. I would start there. Have a risk assessment done for that tree. Um, Sometimes it's as easy as looking at that tree and kind of knowing right from the get-go. If we come up to a tree that's close to a house and it has, root rot, armillaria, something like that, that kind of drives our recommendation right from the get-go. But if it's a tree that they say, "Boy, I just want this tree removed because it's too big," you're gonna have to do better than that. With me, at least, I don't take removing a large tree, a big mature tree, lightly. So, if it's, I have some clients who will say, I'm an admitted city slicker. I don't know anything about trees. This tree is tall and it scares me. And I'll say, well, how come? Why does it scare you? And initially they go through their own kind of generalized anxiety and come out with this, it's too big and it might fall in the house. And we'll kind of go through the, um, what can we do to kind of, make that tree a little bit safer? There's some support cables that we can put in that tree, things like that. So again, it's an individualized conversation that we're kind of trying to bring into a generalized question and answer session. But it's best to just meet with an arborist on site. I'm willing to help out with that anytime. Let's see here. We have another Beth. Beth number 2. The importance of planting native trees and how to decide which is best for your site. I love this question. I just kind of really got into hard and fast kind of native stuff in the last year or so. Just as I kind of like zoomed out of the tree world and kind of into just a general botanical world. Um, natives Native trees is a hard thing to discuss with some people because goals and expectations don't always align, right? So what I find beautiful or functional or ecologically beneficial, some other people might find obnoxious, messy, annoying, right? How many times does somebody say, I don't like that tree because it's messy? It's like, big deal. Big deal. Your tree drops a couple little small sticks here and there, and you got to go out there and pick them up. It's not the tree's fault, right? Um, think about what that tree's doing for the whole ecosystem as a whole. Maybe it's cooling your house and every once in a while. So yeah, maybe if it drops a couple little sticks here and there, some twigs, and you have to rake them up, that seems like a fair trade-off for me. But so many people want to have their trees removed because their pristine little invasive turf lawn has a stick on it. It's not pristine and it's not out of like a HGTV TV show or a Magnolia ad at Target or something like that. The importance of planting natives. We learned that lesson a long, long time ago, probably, but we kind of keep on repeating some of these same mistakes. So the idea of like native is hard to define because some people will say, well, how far back do we have to go to figure out what native means? And it's not so much about like what year we have to go back to. It's about like when our giant continent of Pangea started to split apart millions and millions and millions and millions of years ago, we all of a sudden have these land masses separated by oceans, right? And so what was growing on that particular landmass as it broke away from, what we now consider like all of our continents as they were fused together, but they pulled apart. Um, that's kind of what we look at for being native. So when we talk about native, we're talking about millions of years of evolution. Um, for example, um, our ash trees in America evolved with our soils, with our insects, with our soil fungal networks. And when we have ash trees overseas co-evolving with their soil fungal networks. I'm losing my train of thought here. It's a complicated topic, right? There are large books written about this. But as those trees overseas or the same species evolve with everything like that, now we have two different gene pools of the same tree, which is why emerald ash borer was so destructive. Emerald ash borer co-evolved in Asia with all of their trees, all their ash trees, I should say. So it's never been much of a problem. You might lose a tree or two out there to emerald ash borer, but there's just checks and balances in the ecosystem. So when emerald ash borer came here, none of the trees that we had here had co-evolved with it. So we didn't have those defense enzymes, those allelopathic chemicals that trees can produce to kind of ward off insect attack. So you had a foreign insect come into a brand new ecosystem and absolutely ravage it. Think about like the idea that the U.S. Department of Agriculture was created in the like mid late 1800s as a way to introduce crops from overseas into America, and that has been met with some success, but a lot of failure as well, right? So think about like our apples. Apples evolved. Apples are not native to America, specifically, especially Minnesota, even though Minnesota now has probably one of like the best apple breeding programs in the country, if not the best. Apples are native to like, what is it, like Hungary, Turkey, things like that. Potatoes are another great example. Potatoes native to, I believe it's Peru. Yes, Peru. Potatoes are native to Peru and became very, very popular as an easy to grow, sustainable crop globally, not just in America, but think about like the Irish potato famine, right? You took a non-native crop, brought it to Ireland, and used that to feed the population. But the potato famine popped up because there was a pathogen introduced into Ireland that wiped out the potatoes. So you had a non-native crop introduced into a different ecosystem, which made it more vulnerable. So the potato famine basically wiped out the entire crop and caused mass starvation simply through ecology. It was nothing, no malicious intent or anything like that. So we see this stuff pop up. Buckthorn is another great example. European buckthorn, Rhamnus cathartica. Um, Buckthorn pops up a lot for this. This was brought in as like a hedgerow, right? And buckthorn got way out of control. If there is no checks and balances for buckthorn that we know of yet, a couple research studies might suggest that there are some grasses that can help with that. But we don't have a checks and balances system for buckthorn, which is why it takes over so much of our native forests. Um, a lot of what happens is a forested area gets overrun by buckthorn, spread by birds. They eat the berries. Berries kind of create a sour stomach for them. They poop out the seed germinates. Now we have this proliferation of buckthorn, this hard to kill plant in an unchecked ecosystem. So it's really difficult to manage things like that. So the idea of planting native trees is that it helps your soil mycorrhiza keep those populations in check. Soil mycorrhiza is an underground kind of network of fungus. There's different types of them. There's exomycorrhiza that help our oak trees, things like that. But basically, they kind of help grab water, feed it to the root hairs, keep our soils healthy, things like that. Our soils are living things. It's not just dead dirt. Although during drought, it can become dead dirt. We'll always be talking about native trees, native plants, the benefits of those, but we often see native plants not need as much in terms of plant healthcare in our lawns and ecosystems. They're already adapted to the soils. You can plant it, water it once it establishes. We don't have a lot of things that attack our native plants, and if they do, oftentimes they're not as lethal. That's not to say that our native plants can't be killed by pathogens, because oak wilt is a pathogen that came from overseas, entered the U.S. in probably early to mid 1900s, I want to say, is not established throughout the entire country, but Minnesota is unique in that we do have really bad oak wilt problems, and our red oak population is very, very vulnerable for it. So that's a native tree of ours in Minnesota that gets parasitized and taken out by a fungus or a pathogen that it's never co-evolved with. Let's see here. We'll talk more about natives as well. We'll go into a whole thing about natives. It'll be kind of be a reoccurring theme of this whole video series about the importance of natives. And it's not to say that you can't plant something that's not native. Just because something is not native does not mean that it's invasive, right? We have native trees to Minnesota that are aggressive, sometimes invasive as well. Box elder comes to mind, Acer negundo. Box elder is in the maple genus, so a lot of folks will say, "Oh, the box elder bugs are problematic. They want to cut down their box elder trees." Well, the alternate host for the box elder bug is any other kind of maple tree. So again, if you kind of like get away from the common name back into botanical, you would see that Acer negundo, box elder, shares the same genus as Acer sacrum, Acer saccharinum, which is sugar maple and silver maple as well. Elizabeth asks, what is a good boulevard tree? It's facing south. The ash trees are going to go down. Yeah, this is a big thing. And this is kind of where we get into introducing new trees to our ecosystem, not necessarily pulling mysterious species away, but what I call and what some people are calling near native. Um, we can look at um, I mean, let me scoot back a little bit because the emerald ash borer thing is a repeated error from municipalities, which seems to be like just a generational thing. We took out our elm trees on the boulevards from Dutch elm disease. Hey, Dutch elm disease, that's a fungus overseas where it doesn't have much of an issue. Came here and it was a mystery for a long, long time. One of the vectors was a bug. Is it a bug condition? Is it a fungus condition? They found it was a fungus condition. So again, something that kind of was left overseas and showed up here, took out a lot of our American elms. Tree diversity on the boulevards is going to be wildly important because what we had now was we lost countless elms. We're losing thousands and thousands, millions of ash trees in Minnesota. So a lot of boulevards are just bare now because what they did was they took the elm, planted it all the way down the boulevards. Gets Dutch elm disease, they take them all down. They plant ash all the way down the boulevards. It seems like we've learned our lesson for the most part as boulevards become more diverse. There's a big thing in tree diversity. But the problem for Minnesota in a continental climate is that we don't have the diversity or the ideal amount of diversity to kind of truly diversify our boulevards. We know that we don't want cottonwoods in our boulevards. We don't want silver maples in our boulevards. All of those riparian species of trees that are best left for like riverbanks in the Minnesota River Valley because they grow so fast, fall apart. That's not what you want for your boulevard. If it blows up a sidewalk, I say, all for it, but let a tree be a tree. So what can we plant in its place? So what I'm seeing right now across the metro, Minneapolis is really good with this. We're seeing, Turkish filbert pop in, sycamores come up, buckeye seems to be another one that's popping up. Swamp white oak, a type of oak tree that really holds its form quite well. Linden. Linden trees seem to do really well in the boulevard. There's even a cultivar of linden called the boulevard linden, kind of ideal for that application. I'm more of a fan of ornamental trees in the boulevard, not big shade trees, because oftentimes, our boulevards, we still have some older infrastructure in Minnesota where we have overhead power lines, things like that too. So what happens to our, we have a tree like this, growing down the boulevard, you drive by, and now it has to be, pruned like this to grow around the power line. So we kind of plant these things to fail, a lot of like really terrible invasive Norway maples and things like that too. So it's a tough one. There may even be some resources online for recommendations on boulevard trees as well, but I would look more ornamental. Buckeye is a great application. Serviceberry would be a good one. Ginkgo, I know we just had the big discussion about native trees and the importance of native trees, but ginkgo is, boy, it's darn near fireproof. It's just so hard to kill a ginkgo. They're very, very salt tolerant, which is important for our boulevard trees as we use road salt in the winters in Minnesota. So we get that salinity to pop up and those salts elevate in the soil for a while. It takes a long time for that stuff to at least stabilize back down to a workable level for a lot of trees. I know that ginkgo doesn't support a whole lot of insect life in Minnesota and things like that too, but it also doesn't jump out of the landscape and become hyper invasive, and it doesn't come with a whole bunch of baggage overseas from where it came from. So ginkgo is another good option as well. Let's see. Marianne, I have a couple of overgrown flowering, spring flowering trees. Would cutting a third off the top be reasonable? Like maybe February, earlier March? Probably not. And we're kind of like applying a specialized situation. Your situation might be unique to somebody else's situation with your trees. We tend to look at like 20 to 25% of live crown loss as being workable or tolerable for a tree. To just kind of like indiscriminately whack off a third of a tree, is not exactly reasonable. So I wouldn't go out there, with a handsaw or a hacksaw and start cutting off limbs. Um, but I would kind of consider more about like what overgrown means to you. Does overgrown mean that it looks kind of unruly? Does overgrown mean that it um, is endangering a structure? So is this more of an aesthetic thing? Is this more of a safety thing? Is this an investment into your home where it's rubbing on the siding and the shingles and you don't really have any other choice? Um, I just don't really prune a whole lot of trees unless it's for structure. I think pruning is one of the most misunderstood things in the entire tree world. That we take care of trees by cutting on them, and it's not the case. And it always bothers me to stand up on my soapbox right here and say, XYZ tree care companies down the street, but all they do is prune and remove trees. That's not tree care. That's not caring for anything. There are some applications when pruning is done for the long-term health of the tree, and we can, it's semantics, we can call that care if we want to. Autumn blaze maples need to be profusely pruned in their early years to be formative and stand up to winds later in their life. It's just a very, very weak wooded tree. Again, that Dollar General tree. um, so if you know what to look for, pruning has an application. um, but taking off a third kind of indiscriminately, I would not advise against that, because what you're going to get is a proliferation of water sprout growth. That water sprout growth tends to be weakly attached. They tend to break really easily. And then the wounds that you put in the tree by taking off, however, a third or however percentage you want, if the cuts aren't made properly, it's going to rot out, unfortunately. Nancy comes through for us here with a question. Let's see here. Spruce trees drops needles every year. How do I know if they are stressed? Um, Evergreen trees, conifers, I'd say spruce, but probably more so pines, do go through a seasonal needle drop. You can sometimes even see how old those needles are that fell off. So 3, 4, 5-year-old needles tend to drop off in the interior. I'm looking at my white pine out the window right now. This fall, that interior went a little bit kind of brown, khaki color. Drops those needles when the wind goes away, or when the wind blows through, not goes away. When the wind blows through. Spruce trees can do a little bit of that as well, but what I worry about when I hear spruce trees dropping needles, first of all, it depends kind of where that needle drop is coming from. If it's coming from the tips or some of that new growth, that's pretty worrisome. If it's coming from the inside of the tree and it's kind of creeping outward and you're left with kind of like these pom-poms at the end of live growth, that's probably more of a condition like needle cast, rhizosphere needle cast. My cat is sneezing profusely right now. Hey, you scram. You scram. Sorry if you had to listen to that. Yeah, so needle cast like Rhizosphere, Larula, Stigmina, all these types of different fungal pathogens that get on the needles. Again, we can even bring this back to the native plant argument. One of the worst trees in Minnesota for our not for our environment, but for the tree itself, is the Colorado blue spruce, and Colorado green spruce as well. We pulled those out of their native range, kind of like Colorado, Utah, where it's a little bit more arid, and we brought them to Minnesota. And what we found out is that they're wildly sensitive to humidity, and that humidity creates like a perfect little inoculation period for these types of funguses. So either if you plant this tree, you end up putting it on life support essentially, to keep it alive and keep the fungus away. Insect issues as well, like scales, canker issues, which is like a fungal pathogen of a stem or branch or trunk tissue. So Cytospora canker comes to mind, things like that too. So sometimes we take these trees out, and while they're not bad for our ecosystem, it's bad for the tree. The tree just doesn't belong here, not because we don't like it, not because it's not pretty, because it's not adapted to our environment. Let's see here. We're gonna go for one more question here, then we'll wrap up. Let's see here. See if my cat's still sneezing out in the hallway. Who knows? Might be allergies. Let's see here. Marla, I have a lot of tree questions. This is good. We have a multifaceted one here. Um, I'm not going to read all of them right away. I'm going to take them one by one here. When should maple trees be trimmed? Maple trees can essentially be pruned year round. Um, these really annoying little rules from, like, I don't know, Farmer's Almanac or whatever the heck it is, that trees can only be pruned in months that end in, R or whatever. It's not true. It's just not true. It's a good little catch-all for the general population to have a rule of thumb in their head that they can kind of like go to and say, oh, pruning in months that end in ER. But it's just not true. There are some ideal windows for pruning, but professionals prune maple trees year round. If you want to avoid the um, sap flow, I can understand that. But it doesn't mean that if you prune during sap flow that it's particularly detrimental to the tree. It's more annoying for you because you get covered in sap that drips on top of you. So maple trees can be pruned year round. I mentioned the ideal windows of kind of like the dormant season. Late winter, early spring, things like that too, when the tree is still dormant. Sure, you can do that, with the idea being that um, if I prune my tree in July or August, it's more susceptible to pathogens or bugs. It's just not really true. The proper cut with the proper tool and the proper location of the tree um, will seal itself over. You don't have to worry about those things. We don't have a lot of vascular issues like oak wilt or Dutch elm disease that require winter pruning, right? We only have 2 trees in Minnesota that truly require um, winter or dormant pruning. Number 1 is any oak species, and number 2 is the American elm. And there are still quite a few American elms around as well. So those 2 require um, dormant pruning to reduce the risk of oak wilt and Dutch elm disease. Almost every other tree, um, game on. It can be pruned, yeah. Can ash trees be treated for ash borer in the winter? They cannot. And the reason is that ash treatments nowadays tend to be trunk injections. There might be a little bit of soil applied insecticide going on still, um, but that would be the exception, certainly not the rule. Bark sprays are out the window just through an efficacy standpoint. So a lot of what happens is that um, if this is our tree trunk, we're drilling a series of holes around the base of the tree into the tree's vascular system, and we're delivering the product in there. So it can't happen in the winter because the tree just isn't moving and conducting water as it would during the growing season. So we rely a lot on the growing season. Um, as we treat the tree moves water from the roots to the top of the canopy, right, ground to crown, and it grabs the product and moves it up and disperses it throughout the canopy as well. So and another thing that you need is you need the tree to be leafed out, right? Because that's how the tree moves water, transpiration, respiration, all these types of things. It's just how the tree moves water from the roots to the canopy. So winter would not work in this application because you'd be basically treating a dormant zombie, I guess, for lack of a better term, at that point. So best left to the growing season for that one. How can I kill a sapling that rooted in an inconvenient spot? It's too hard to pull, and so I try and cut it as close to the ground as I can. It's embedded itself between a cement driveway that butts it up to a wood retaining wall. This is an easy one. Cut it down and just dab a little bit of like concentrated Roundup. I said Roundup. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Or some brush killer. Active ingredient in that might be triclopyr, a really good herbicide for woody plants. So triclopyr would be the active ingredient if you can find anything like that. I kind of mockingly said did a little scary thing when I said Roundup because there's just so much misinformation around Roundup and glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup. And what I always tell people is, like, if you can't understand the distinction between a spot treatment on like a tiny little stub that you don't want to like resprout again, and flying with a crop duster over a Roundup ready crop of corn or soybeans, if you can't see the distinction between that, you're not even thinking critically about it. Yes, glyphosate can be problematic when it's done in these giant swaths like I just described, like going over all of our food and things like that too. I think it's even illegal in Europe to use glyphosate on crops and things like that. It's like a mass thing. But in the application of you have a little tiny paintbrush and you dab some on a stub and you're going to compare those two, we're just not even having the same conversation at that point. So I would cut it down, Marla. I would add a little bit of concentrated herbicide through like a little paintbrush. Sponge brushes are really good. Bingo daubers, you can get a bingo dauber of kind of herbicide as well, and just kind of paint that outer ring of the bark of that plant. That'll kind of knock down that thing from resprouting for you. What should be taken into account when planting a river birch in a front yard? How far from the house, edge of a street, etc.? That's a really good question because you're kind of thinking proactively about where a tree could go so it doesn't cause a problem. For this, I would say I would put a river birch, and please do not buy a multi-stem river birch. They're just problematic in the future later in their life. You can get a single stem river birch. It just does so much better structurally. Without seeing your property, I really can't answer that one. How far away from the house, how far away from the edge of the street, really just comes down to maintenance. The closer it is to the house, the more pruning you might have to do away from the roof later in that tree's life when it gets more established. I would have to really see your house first. There's no general rule about like, it has to be 30 feet or else, and if it's 25 feet, it's going to be a problem. Don't worry about the tree like blowing through your home foundation. That's like a very common myth that we see. Trees don't create foundation problems, but they can exacerbate pre-existing foundation problems. It's not like the damn Kool-Aid man where he breaks in, through your wall like those old commercials and it screams, "Oh yeah," when it's time to party in the house and the tree roots are ready to come in. Her last question was, how much does it typically cost to grind up a stump? Oh man, anywhere probably between 100 and $1,500. Just depends on the size of the stump. It depends on the access to the stump. Do you have to take the stump grinder for a journey around the entire property into the backyard, into the back 40 and way far away? Is it a simple little front yard stump? That basically comes down to most stump grinding is priced by the size of the stump and the location of the stump. Time on site, that's how they do these things. They're just looking for a simple return per hour. Nothing special with that one. That's pretty much all I got before this whole thing dovetails off into some more sophomoric humor here. Thank you for joining me. We're at about an hour, which is right where I wanted it to be. I have a whole list of your guys' questions from previous. I'm saving them so we can do this again in the future. Reach out anytime you have any other questions. Follow my page, Misanthrope in the Wild, if you want to kind of just follow along as I basically aggregate tree information into like one place. I'm not going to take notes on a notepad and save those for the rest of my life. The idea of creating a page to talk about trees is like, I asked myself the question, what would have taken me as a kid to care about trees or care about just the ecosystem in general, and I want to make a fun page that can do that. Maybe this video is not representative of that because it's me sitting on a wall because it's winter outside and it's just not a great opportunity to go look at trees while they're flourishing in the growing season. It's kind of boring, it's dormant out there, things like that. But a lot of science classes kind of get the knock that they're boring, dry, things like that too. So we're going to have fun learning about trees and hopefully get some people more, interested in the ecosystem and the natural world around them. Have a great holidays. Love you. Thanks. Bye.